My name is Mary. I'm Executive Vice President of ACC. And at ACC, many of you know that we have a marketing and information theme that says, good morning. My name is Mary Hensley. I'm Executive Vice President for College Operations, and I am ACC. And it's with that presence this morning that I am so pleased to join you. And I promise you that this will not be short. Some of you were listening and you got that. This will not be necessarily a short presentation. And I apologize in advance because I don't want to offend anybody, but what we're going to do is take a walk through history. And when you walk through history, history is historical, meaning we're going to go back in time. Some of us, therefore, are going to challenge ourselves to remember some historical events. Some of us are going to show our age. And so I don't want to offend anybody in the course of that. And so if you don't want to participate, don't. You'll be graded accordingly. Okay. Are you ready to start this journey with me this morning? Are you? Are you? That's not good enough yet. Are you ready to start this journey with me this morning? There you go. All right, now here's going to be your first test. In order to see the PowerPoint well, I have to dim the lights. Beware, I move around. If I catch you snoring, I will ask you a question in which you will have to respond to the whole class. Right? So listen up, even though I'm going to dim the lights a little bit. So let's see which ones work closest to the screen so that we can see that PowerPoint just a little better. That one. Are you still awake? I haven't lost you yet. You're still with me. All right, for eyes over 40, here go the glasses. You ready? And my history is that I didn't have to wear glasses until I hit the age of 40, actually about 45. So for you youngsters in the room, when they tell you that there's this magical decade of age that when you hit 40, everything starts to fall or go bad, it's true. I'm so sorry to tell you that, but it happens. And so for me, I have to have some glasses to walk through our journey with us this morning. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the milestones in history. All right, significant events that have occurred at least as I can remember, and some before. And we're going to talk about how those events in history impacted what has become Austin Community College. Ladies and gentlemen, this is, I told you, not going to be a short presentation. So what I'm going to do is go all the way back in time to about 1898. And through the course of this next hour and a half or so, we are going to run through history all the way over to about 2011. Are you okay? Are you with me? All right, and in order to do that, I'm going to talk about decades and kind of chunks of time. What's a decade? How many years? 10 years. So I'm going to talk about decades and generally what happened during certain periods of time and how that influenced and impacted what has become now to be Austin Community College. You can ask questions along the way. There's going to be a lot of interaction. Are you ready? Do you have your tennis shoes on? No. Do you have your shoes kicked off? Has anybody been bold enough to actually do that yet? Shall I kick off mine and run barefoot so that you'll know that it is okay to be casual? This is fine. This is Friday. There's a reason why they call it TGIF, right? Okay, so here we go. The first community college in the United States. Anybody want to take a guess what state it was in? It's not on the slide, so there's no cheating by looking. Who knew that? How did you know that?
I read the books.
You just got a prize. Yay. A hand slap. Congratulations. It was Joliet Junior College in Illinois. That is exactly right. Congratulations. Wow. You know, I should stop and say that I had a mentor in this academy program who emailed me last night and who quit. No, she did so for very valid reasons. She, and you all know who she is, her name's Kelly, but she had many things that were impacting her time, and so she's unable to participate in the academy this year. And so I may have to adopt you as my mentee because you were so bright and so smart and actually read the book. I'm so proud of you. That's wonderful. All right, my focus is going to be now, though, what happened in Texas. So in Texas, there's an interesting history to how community colleges began. First of all, they did not begin publicly. They began through the private sector. And the first one was in a place called Decatur, Texas, not far from Dallas. And it was a Baptist college. So it was a privately funded institution. It was established in 1898. And it started off offering courses. And in 1965, it moved to Dallas, Texas. And it changed its name, and it's now called Dallas Baptist University, where it exists today and has about 5,000 students enrolled. So interesting that the first community college in Texas was not a public institution, but rather a private institution. Well, then subsequently, the publics came along, and they started primarily in the 1920s. And this is very interesting because the thinking at that time was that community colleges, then called junior colleges, were in fact junior colleges. And the thinking at that time was that they were more of an extension of high school than they were a real college in that sense. And so they were created primarily out of school districts and out of school district boundaries. And the first ones that started were Grubbs Vocational Institute in Arlington, Texas, and Tarleton College in Stephenville. That happened back in, I've got to get to this side of the room. I've gone from 1898 now to 1917. Those were the first two in the state of Texas. During the period of time in the 1920s, from about 22 to 28, there were 17 more community colleges that started in Texas. But that was the original beginning. Then things happened quickly after that over a period of time. In 1941, the legislature of Texas decided that it could grant to the community colleges some money. And they were so generous. Their allocation was $50 per full-time student. And that was actually quite wonderful because there was no state funding prior to that time that went towards community colleges. Remember I told you that community colleges started primarily as an extension from school districts? So the governing authority over the community colleges that started was under the Texas Education Agency. How many of you have ever heard of the TEA or the Texas Education Agency? Raise your hand. Most of you have. I'm going to come back to that in a minute because the Texas Education Agency in the 1940s oversaw all of the community colleges that were becoming available in Texas. The second thing that happened that was interesting, in 1962, the Texas Supreme Court allowed junior colleges to levy a tax, a property tax. And now I have to go to the whiteboard because we're going to use multimedia today. So tell me, to the best that you can guess, at this time, how did community top colleges get their funding? From where did they get money in order to operate? Today there are three primary ways you do it. Can you tell me one? Say it again, Brian. Tuition and fees. Tuition and fees. Tell me now a second way. Say it again. State funding. Remember the $50 per student. State funding. And now look what has happened in 1962. It is allowing community colleges to tax property owners and bring in a third part of revenue. I want you to really focus on this one because it has a pivotal part in the history of ACC. So this one became creating a tax base. Ladies and gentlemen, to this very day, those are the primary ways in which community colleges are funded. Look at that last one. What was it that I wrote up there? I didn't hear it again. All right, I want you to shout it out this time. What was the third way that community colleges got some funding?
Tax base.
All right, and you're going to understand why in a few minutes, why I'm asking you to listen to that part and pay attention to what it is. All right, Then, during this time, the Texas Education Agency was still overseeing all of the community colleges. And there began some thinking that no, community colleges are really a community college, a college that serves its community, not an extension of high school. And so they changed the governing board of the state and moved it from the Texas Education Agency to a new entity, which ultimately changed its name and became the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Sometimes we refer to that agency as the Coordinating Board. When I first started working at community colleges, no one explained the history of community colleges to me. And I would periodically hear references to the Coordinating Board. And I'll bet you now, this is fess up time, I probably went a year thinking, what is the Coordinating Board? And I knew we had a board of trustees. Was that the Coordinating Board? I didn't get it. And frankly, I was probably too embarrassed to ask, somebody, what is a coordinating board? So I finally understood it, and now I can explain it to you so I can save you the embarrassment of asking somebody someday, what is the coordinating board? So the coordinating board, does anybody know where it's located today? Where? Sonia? Right about off of 183, just out south, or just to the east of 183. And it's moved twice since I've been at ACC. It used to be on the west side of 183, and it's more recently moved to the east side of 183. The coordinating board oversees all the universities, all higher education institutions, all community colleges in the state of Texas. So it moved from the authority under the Texas Education Agency to now this new agency called the Coordinating Board, or the longer term Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Are you with me so far? Has anybody lost me? Because I'm only up to the now 1965. We have a long way to go. Are you with me? All right. Around that time then, it was determined that we needed to change the name from junior college to community college. And this is why. Junior colleges primarily did the academic transfer courses. This is your Englishes, your maths, your sciences, your psychologies, your sociologies. It was considered, and they were created to be courses or colleges that would provide courses that would transfer to the four-year institution. But there became a greater need. There became a greater need for student services, for counseling and guidance, for developmental education, which at that time was known as remedial or compensatory education, for workforce courses, a continuing education, many other kinds of activities, and that gap was being filled by the junior colleges. And so the term junior college no longer met the description of what was actually occurring. They were beyond the scope of just two-year transfer courses. So the names changed to become community colleges. Now there's some inference that's meaningful to the word community that I'll explain in just a moment. At the time then, in the late 1960s, the state of Texas then began to have community college districts that began to pop up all over the state. And in the late 60s, there were about 40 by now that existed in Texas. Most Texans lived within about 40 or 50 miles of their local community college. Texas, however, is a very large state, right? All right. And so not everyone did. I said most did. All right, now keep that thought in mind. And now I'm going to take you through a walk through the decades. So we're now to the 1960s. Some of us are going to begin to show our age. And some of us are going to see how well we remember our history lessons from high school and college. Let's go back to the 1960s. I have to ask this question. You do not have to answer it, but it's kind of fun to participate if you would like. Every year when I talk to the academy, I ask this question. All right, so here you go. You ready for it? All right, I am going to ask you. Here, you ready? Who was already born and living in this room? Were you living in the 1960s, anywhere from 1960 to 1969? If you were, raise your hand. All right, let's get a count. I'm kind of curious. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. maybe half in the room in the 1960s. Y'all, that is scary to me. I lived the 1960s, and I automatically think, oh, you know what we're talking about when we reference certain things that occurred in the 1960s. And I am astounded as I get older that people don't know what I'm talking about. And one of the most disheartening moments in my life was when my son, who is now 24, my youngest son is now 24, and one day when he was just a little tyke, my husband and I were talking about Elvis Presley. And he spoke up and said, "Who's Elvis Presley?" And it was precious, and my heart still kind of just, tugs when I remember that moment. And then I thought, how could you not know Elvis Presley? And then I had to think, oh, wait a minute, my son was not born until 1987. But Elvis Presley was such a massive part of my growing up years and my teen and early 20s that how could anyone on earth not know who Elvis Presley is? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was one of my first moments of understanding that I was aging. You too shall have those moments. They're not always fun, but they are a revelation. So let's look and see, for those of us who remember and those of us who know a little bit about history and read about it, let's see what was happening in the 1960s. All right, I put a few issues up here. Who's this? JFK. It's interesting that you said JFK because it was John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr., President of the United States, and we commonly referred to him as JFK, part of our close familiarity with this very special president who at that time was one of the youngest presidents in the history of the United States, of course. And unfortunately, we all know what happened to him, I believe. What tragic event occurred in regards to JFK? He was assassinated, of course. And in my lifetime, of course, that was unheard of, just as it would almost be unheard of today to you. But not as much so, because we live in a world today that is much more confrontational, certainly scarier. We use words such as terrorist. We have invasions and wars. We've had invasions and wars before. But the last president who had been assassinated was Abraham Lincoln. And I thought of that in terms of my history class that I read, or 7th grade history, or 8th grade history, or college history. I didn't think in my naive mind in the 1960s, I did not believe that that really happened in the real world. I thought that was something you read about, almost like a story. So when JFK was assassinated, there was it was like the onset of a completely different world in the United States. You will hear people say that on that day, the United States lost its innocence. We had been in a world of happy days. I Love Lucy. We didn't have these kinds of things happen. It was a shocking event. Shocking event. And to this day, people who were alive at that time can tell you where they were the moment they heard that JFK had been assassinated. Oddly enough for me, and I thought this was very coincidental, I was sitting in a government class my junior year in high school, and the principal came over the over the intercom, and announced that he had a serious and important announcement to tell us, and that he was very sorry to tell us that the President of the United States had been shot. And he dismissed school immediately and sent us all home. And we all went home and we turned on our black and white television sets. Each family, if they were lucky, had one. And everyone in the family, and for neighbors who did not have a television set, they went to a neighbor's home who had a television set. And during the course of that day then, not long thereafter, we learned that the president had died. Ladies and gentlemen, the world stopped at that moment. For those of you who weren't around at that time, I want you to understand the pivotal moment of that occurrence. It changed our nation. It changed people who lived during that time. For 3 days, the United States stopped. Nothing happened. Everyone watched television. There were no events. Nothing else was on television. There were no cable channels at that time. You had CBS, NBC, and ABC. They all focused on this event. There were no activities, no Boy Scout meetings, no Girl Scout meetings, no community events. Everything stopped. Stores closed. School closed. The United States shut down in total unison in watching the events transpire of this assassination and trying to wrap their understanding of their minds, and it wasn't possible. What has happened, and how, and why, and who, and when, and the incredulous feeling that no one could understand what was going on. And then secondly, after that, to try to understand that the person alleged to have made the assassination was he himself assassinated a day or two later. You can't understand the inability of people at that time to realize what was happening. And so that was in the early 1960s. And it launched, unfortunately, it was the pivotal point in my mind of some of the things that began to happen in the 1960s. For those of you who remember, do you remember the words of the 1960s, words like revolutionary, countercultural, do your own thing, me, I, drugs, sex, pot, marijuana. These were words, marijuana and pot, I didn't even know what that was. Nobody really did. These years were the entree to a different lifestyle in the United States. And there were a couple of others that were kind of interesting. Lyndon Johnson, of course, became the president after JFK, and the Beatles came in. All right, is there anybody in this room who's ever heard of the Beatles? Raise your hand. I'm looking to see if I have any of my son's friends in here who may not know the Beatles. What was different about the Beatles? Can somebody tell me a little bit about what was different about the Beatles? Why were they such a phenomenon? Let me give you a hint. All right, can anybody take it from there? Right. And the first thing you said was that it had a different look, and that was my hint. So what am I saying when I'm doing this? The hair, because we had gone from the flat tops of the 1950s. And now Elvis was pretty radical, and that was one of the reasons why he was so well known, because he had the combed back hair and the ducktail in the back. But the Beatles had the long, kind of like the Dutch boy look, or you put your bowl over it and over your head and cut around it, so you have the long hair. Now coming from the flat tops and the do and the dab that you put on your head to hold it that way, this floppy long hair was an enormous phenomenon. It's just amazing. And when they got on stage, there were 4 of them, and they would go like this, and their hair would flop. And all the girls would go, ah! And swoon and faint. And there was this show on Sunday nights, because remember, we only had the 3 channels back then. There was this show on Sunday nights, and anybody remember what show I'm gonna reference? Ed Sullivan. You see, I told you some of us are going to show our age here, the Ed Sullivan Show, and everybody watched it on Sunday nights, and it was a variety show, and he would bring on different acts. And so your entree into becoming known throughout the United States was to go on the Ed Sullivan Show. And that's how Elvis had become popular and well known. So it was an enormous event when the Beatles, as you said, came from England and appeared and landed in the United States to make their appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. And they were an overnight phenomenon. But that hairstyle and that different kind of look contributed to the beginning of the changes of the 1960s. So you can see that we are now in an age of lost our innocence. The world is beginning to change. And this is why part of the 1960s was such a pivotal point in history for the United States. All right, many other things that were very important happened in the 1960s. Clearly, this is one of the very most. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, which was an implementation of access and equality for all in the United States. extremely important piece of legislation. The Vietnam War. How many of you have heard of the Vietnam War? Raise your hand. How many of you had friends, relatives, loved ones that served in the Vietnam War? Raise your hand. You remember it well. Do you remember that this is one of the only wars in the United States that was publicly, there were demonstrations against it, and when the returning vets came home, they were not always revered for their contribution in the military services. That, ladies and gentlemen, was a first. Because generally after World War I and after World War II and after Korea and so forth, we welcomed our vets back and we showed in many ways our appreciation towards them. But during the Vietnam War, there was much controversy about this conflict. And many of the people who returned to a nation that was not always showing that it was grateful for their contribution and their service. And so that was a very controversial period of time as well. And then, of course, Martin Luther King, the wonderful Martin Luther King, unfortunately also was assassinated. What a tremendous blow. If you thought that the nation was shocked over JFK, you know, it was totally incredulous. How could this happen again? How could this happen to this wonderful peacemaker, Martin Luther King? In so short a time, after JFK's, what, my gosh, is this country coming to? And that's when you began to hear phrases like that you hear today, don't you? What has happened in so short a time? We just left the 1950s. We're now in the 1960s. And it seems like, pardon me because I don't, all heck is breaking loose. All right, and then we also had this event. Now this one's kind of fun and interesting. So I'm just going to say Woodstock. And if you know what I'm talking about, raise your hand. All right, I'm looking. Any of my son's friends? Everybody knows Woodstock. Now the cameraman, do you know Woodstock? Okay, he had to raise his hands too. Isn't that interesting that we all know what Woodstock is? Or we think we do anyway. So let's see, let's peel a little bit out of you. Woodstock. Tell me a little bit about Woodstock. What was it? Where was it? When was it? What was it all about? New York. You got it, Brian. It occurred in New York. It was a say it. Say it.
Drug and sex festival.
3-day drug and sex festival.
And music.
And music. You got it. That's exactly right. That's basically what it was. And does anybody else know anything more about Woodstock?
I thought it was a movement. The Woodstock,
it sort of became a movement after that. So I'm so glad you said that. So let's talk about that a little bit. It was a concert, yeah. So I'll tell you a little bit about it. It was everywhere. What else do you know about Woodstock, anybody? Because this is kind of fun. It was all outdoors. Jimi Hendrix. Okay, what else? And I'm going to try to give you a quick synopsis of Woodstock. Please tell it for everybody to hear.
One of the early people that worked in her office had said that his mother's biggest regret in life was that she had tickets for Woodstock and she didn't go because it was raining.
That is exactly right. You all, your contributions to this discussion are phenomenal. It was just great. So would you like for me to tell you? I want you to know I am not an expert on Woodstock. I want you to know that I was not there. But everybody who was alive at that time knows about Woodstock. So here's kind of a brief synopsis of what happened. There were these 4 young men. The oldest was 27, and he was heir to a pharmaceutical company, a family that had a pharmaceutical company. And he and a friend of his got an idea that they wanted to create a recording studio for folk singers, which were kind of on their way out at that time because the rock and roll had come in with the Beatles and others. And they wanted to create a recording studio and a retreat for rock and roll people. And so they decided that they wanted to create this retreat in New York. They went to this small town. I think the name of it was Hillkill, but don't quote me on that one. I believe that was the name of it, but it was a small town. And they talked to the city fathers, and they determined that they could have this event at this location in New York. Further, they decided that they wanted to sell tickets to the event, and that the event would sell 50,000 for 50,000 people. That's what they envisioned. It would be this grand, enormous 50,000 person event. And the event was going to be for 3 days. And I think it was, if you bought a ticket for 1 day, it was $7. If you bought a ticket for 2 days, it was $13. And if you bought a ticket for 3 days, it was $18. Now remember, I don't know much about this. Well, the tickets went fast and furiously. And the city fathers in this small town became concerned. Now, now wait a minute. Who's coming here? What kind of people are coming here? And you're going to have 50,000 of them here? King's X, I think we're going to change our mind. So they passed, at the city council level or the town level, they passed a ruling that the event could not occur. Well, what were these 4 individuals to do? There were these two young men that started it, and they had brought 2 more friends with them into the venture. And they had sold all of these tickets and had promoted all of this event. And for these 50,000 people that they wanted to come, only there was no place to come. So, and time was short. It was almost time for the event to occur. So they talked and went around and looked, and they found a dairy farmer who had a 600-acre farm. And he agreed to allow them to have the event on his dairy farm property. So it was out in the land itself, in the hills. It was not in a building. It was not in an auditorium. It was not in a stadium. It was out just in the dairy farm, out on the grass. Right. So they had planned for 50,000 people, but word got around that this event now was going to be on the 600-acre open grassy area. So people started saying, well, I think I will go. And the word started passing from outside of just the New York area by word of mouth. And of course, I don't know anything about this. But people decided to go. And so word of mouth got going and got going and got going. And in a matter of just days, it appeared that there were going to be about 1 million people to show up to this event. Well, the 4 young men who had never done anything like this before, who had planned for a 50,000 event with the police and the porta potties and all of that kind of security and everything for 50,000, were now beyond belief. As to, oh my gosh, you know, what are we going to do? 1 million people? I can't wrap my head around 1 million people. So they tried to construct some fences, and so that they can control the audience coming in, right? So the event was going to be for 3 days, and the day before the event started, people started arriving. And they had only put the fence up around a certain portion. The rest of the 600 acres, of course, was unfenced. So people just poured in with all of their friends and their relatives and their kids and their boyfriends and their whatevers, and they just poured in. Well, when they started pouring in, when the day of the event started, the people with their tickets, you know, why have a ticket? Because everybody's already walking in. So they decided pretty much on the spot that they would just have to make it an open event, because there was no way to make sure that people were going through gates and collecting tickets. Well, that just opened up the snowball to roll all the more, because once people then heard, oh, you can come to this rock concert and there is no charge, people started hopping in their cars, driving to upstate New York. The lines got backed up for miles. People parked their cars in the middle of the street and abandoned them for 3 days and walked over to the dairy farm. She's looking at me like, are you kidding me? This is true. And walked over, and it became, Brian, say what it became again.
A love fest.
A love fest. And it was free love in the literal and the figurative sense of the word. And there were drugs everywhere in every variety. I know nothing about any of this. I just heard about it. It was unbelievable. And then you used the word rain. All right, so say what you said again.
Well, she didn't go because
it was raining. It poured rain. And what happens on a dairy farm with rain? Well, I'll leave it to your imagination. Not just mud, They were covered in mud and others. Byproducts. That's a good way to put it. Say it again. Mushrooms started to grow. It was a mess in every sense of the word, but nobody cared. I mean, they were high and happy and loving, and the world was great. And they had all of these fabulous rock stars who came, who were just now kind of coming out into the forefront. Now, some of these had not been on the Ed Sullivan Show, I assure you. And they estimated it finally that about 500,000 people went, about 500,000 people actually got in. There were more that were trying to get in, but the cars were backed up so far back on the highway, it was too many miles to walk in to get to Woodstock at the 600 dairy farm, 600-acre dairy farm. So they couldn't get in, but there were more that were trying to get in. But actually, the actual count of how many ended up being there was around 500,000. And it dwindled. There was the maximum number the first day, and then it dwindled a little bit. And then by the last day, it dwindled more. And then by the last act, they had these singers that were coming on schedule throughout the days. The last singer, Brian, you mentioned him. Who was the last singer? But you may not know this, but you said it a minute ago. Jimi Hendrix. He sang and played there. Do you even know who Jimi Hendrix is? Yep. Okay. If you know who Jimi Hendrix is, raise your hand. Okay, there's maybe one or two. Okay, Narita, I'll just call you out. Narita doesn't know who Jimi Hendrix is. You can go and Google it. Well, on the last day, there were about 25,000 people that he played for. But there had never been anything like that in the history of the world, ever. A music festival in the first place was something that was unknown to that kind of a degree. And the paid audiences and having to have security and bringing in porta potties and having food. And they all ran out of food. There wasn't enough food in the town to feed 500,000 people. This was a little tiny town. And remember, we're out on a 600-acre dairy farm anyway. Everything that could go wrong went wrong, and no one seemed to care at all. And Woodstock became infamous after that as a pivotal moment in the 1960s. So look what happened in the 1960s. Now get your head wrapped around first, I Love Lucy, Happy Days, the Leave It to Beaver lifestyle, and then look at what happened in the 60s. JFK is assassinated. His assassin is assassinated, or his alleged assassin is assassinated. Martin Luther King is assassinated. We have a Vietnam War that is highly controversial. We now have drugs and free love and sex everywhere. We have a transition in the whole music culture. The entire music from Perry Como to Elvis Presley and now into the Beatles, into rock stars. We have then something that was even equally controversial, and that is the implementation of the draft. Who knows what a draft is when I say the implementation of a draft? Raise your hand. Not all of you will. Okay, most of you do. Since 1942, we had not had a draft, but because of the Vietnam War, we did not have enough soldiers who volunteered for the services. And in order to be able to have enough people to send over there and fight in that conflict, the United States implemented a draft, which meant in general terms and in simple terms that you could be called up and have to serve in one of the armed forces. You could volunteer to serve, but if you didn't, then you could be called upon. And all males at that time had to sign up and register with the draft, and every month they pulled numbers. And if your number was called, you were drafted into the military.
Do you know at the time the government paid the soldiers?
Yes, they did pay them. They did pay them, but it was certainly disruptive. Now, there were some exemptions that you could get for the draft. At that time, I believe some of them were if you were married and had children, or if you were enrolled in college. And there were a few others, too. If you had some certain medical kinds of situations, there were some exemptions. But basically, by far and above, almost every male in the United States was eligible for the draft. And when your number was called, you went in for your physical, you passed your physical, they told you what day to report, and there you were, and you had a commitment for a couple of years to serve in the military. How many of you remember that? A few of us who lived in that time. The draft had not been implemented since 1942. So here we were now drafting our young men into service, into a war that many people did not agree with. And so it was a very tumultuous decade. In fact, Lord, let's hope that sometimes that we have some decades that we can pray for that are a little more peaceful than the 1960s. But you will hear why people talk about the 1960s so much. You won't hear that talk so much about the 1970s, the 1950s, the 1980s, the 1940s. They all have their particular milestones. But we went literally from this end of the spectrum to that end of the spectrum in a period of 10 years. And our world, as we knew it, changed dramatically. All right. Shall we get back to about here now? I'm up to about where Ken is. We're now in the 1960s. Let's see what's happening now, shall we, in Austin? All right. Remember I had last told you that we had about how many community college districts in Texas? Say it. 40. We had about 40. Guess which location in Texas did not have a community college? Austin. That's unusual since we were the capital, right? You would think we would have been one that would have had a community college. No, we weren't. There were about 4 at that time, major areas that did not. Houston was one, Beaumont was one, Port Arthur was one, and El Paso was one. Now, interesting, we did have 6 universities in the Austin area at that time. And to this day, now think about it, I'll bet you we can name them. All right, 2 of them were public, 4 of them were private. Let's see if we can focus on which were the 2 that were public at that time. What do you think? UT, University of Texas was one. What do you think the other one was in the nearby area? Nope, Southwest Texas State, that is now known as Texas State. Those were the 2 publics. Let's see if we can figure out which were the 4 privates at that time. Say it. Concordia, Houston-Tillotson, Southwestern University in Georgetown, Houston-Tillotson, Concordia, Southwestern, say it. St. Ann Arbor University. So those existed, but no community college at all. All right. So here's what happened, and we're going to speed up our history lesson a little bit now, and there are certain decades we're going to fly through and others that we're going to focus on. And the 1960s is the one we focused on. Maybe that was because I was in college in the 1960s and I remember it well, but I do have to say it was so pivotal. So now we are coming out of the 1960s, and here's what happened in regards to trying to get a community college. There were a group of community members who decided that they wanted to create a community college in the Austin area. So they went out for an election in 1963, and their proposal was to create a junior college called Travis County Junior College. All right? The motion to, the election to create Travis County Junior College passed. However, eyes to my right, guess what didn't pass? Say it loudly. Tax base did not pass. Now there was a man named Mr. Wills. I think his name was Stubby Wills. And he had been active in that election, and he worked for Southwestern Bell. And he and others tried again a few years later to have another election to get the funding to create it. So they had an election in 1968, 5 years later. Sonia, guess what? I don't want that to go yet. Guess what happened in the election in 1968? Who said that? It failed. Sonia got it. It failed again. No tax base for the community college. So people wanted one, they just didn't want to pay for one. And so Mr. Wills became the chairman of the board of the Travis County, sorry, I'm getting ahead here. I'm trying to go backwards. Let me get this one back. There it is. I'm sorry. So Mr. Wills became the president of the, not the president, the chair of the board of the Travis County Junior College of a non-existent junior college. There was no junior college because there was no money to have a junior college. So that was interesting in that we tried to get one once, twice, and still couldn't get one to pass with the funding. So Central Texas College, which is located in where? Killeen, and is still there today, was created in 1965. And because we needed some courses taught here that were more open to the kinds of courses that the community colleges would offer, that St. Ed's and Concordia and Houston and Southwestern and Texas, University of Texas and Texas State were not able to offer, Central Texas College came in and started offering some courses here in Austin, and they called it the Austin Model Project. And what they did primarily were to serve disadvantaged students, as well as they were trying to start offering some workforce development programs. And these were some of the ones that they offered. So Central Texas College came in and sent their faculty over here to teach classes in Austin. All right, now we're going to go to the 1970s. We're going to skip, because that's what happened in the 1960s. Thank you. Let's go to the 1970s. Take a look at that for just a minute. See if you recognize anything. All right. Ava, I heard you say something. What did you say? Yep. All right. Atari. Tell us about Atari and Pong.
That was probably the first video game that was our
It was the first of the games, right? And we loved it. Can you describe Pong or Pac-Man, Mr. Pac-Man? And can you describe what those were like?
Oh, big old mouse. Little dots, and it was fun. We didn't have one for the
You had to have it. It was the Christmas toy of the year. Every child in the United States, and a few adults, wanted an Atari. So let's tell you what it looked like. So the Atari was interesting. You plugged it into your television set, which for the most part we now had begun to have some color TVs, but not everybody had a color TV. You plugged it in, and up on your television screen it looked like this. And if you wanted to play Pong, this was the revolutionary, exciting, every child in America addicted to this game. You ready? There was a little ball, little dot like this, and you had a side over here, and you had a side over here. And it was, think about it like ping pong. The ball would move this way and this way. And you had a little mouse, but it wasn't exactly called a mouse at that time. You had a little device, and you could move this line, which was not a lengthy line, it was a little dash like that. And you would take the dash, and you would move it to hit the ball. So if the ball was coming to you in this direction, you would take your dash and move it up here, and as soon as that ball hit your dash, it would pong back over to here. And if the person over here who was playing on the other handset would take their little rectangular little line, and they would move it up to catch and meet the pong and block it, and then it would bounce back. And so sometimes it would go this way, and then they would bounce it back, and sometimes it would go that way. And so the idea was almost like a tennis match, to pong it back, like a ping pong. Oh Lord, were we thrilled. Did we spend an hour or two a day on Pong? Oh no. Every waking moment. Kids fought over who could play Pong and when it was their turn. Parents had to allocate time for homework and time for Pong, and then every now and then try to get in piano lessons. People fought over this one, the Pong. Then there was another one called Pac-Man. Does anybody remember Pac-Man? Yep. Tell us about Pac-Man, and I'll try to draw it for you. Right. Pac-Man kind of looked like a semicircle with an open mouth. And he would chomp, 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 chomp and eat the dots. And he would go through a maze eating the dots. And every now and then, these things that I always thought looked like hearts but were little ghosts, as you said, little ghoulies things, they'd come up And if the ghost ate you, you lost points, and if you ate the ghost, you won points. And the idea was to clear all the dots, and then after you worked your pathways through, then more dots would appear. And eventually, somebody would come and chew up your Pac-Man. And while the Pac-Man was eating, somebody was after the Pac-Man to eat the Pac-Man. And if your Pac-Man was eaten, then the game was over. Well, that was unheard of because we had gone from Pong to Pac-Man. And ladies and gentlemen, the world was addicted and still is. You know, and ask me because I carry a BlackBerry and an iPhone and an iPad and I have a Mac computer and a PC computer. And we're all addicted, and I am too, admittedly so. And we are all tied to our social networking, and this was the beginning of it in the 1970s. Remember that. This one was interesting. How many of you like to do crossword puzzles? 3, 4. Okay, when you get old, you start to do crossword puzzles too. But I'm going to give you a crossword puzzle clue right now. When you get a question that asks you for a popular musical band and it's 4 letters, it's ABBA. ABBA. Often used in crossword puzzles. Came out of Sweden, I believe that group did. And they were another group that came in that were very revolutionary during the 1970s. The Vietnam War ended in the 1970s. Many, as I said, of our returning vets came home not to necessarily welcoming arms throughout the nation. This one is interesting, especially since Steve Jobs just passed away. The Apple computer, the personal computer, came out in the 1970s. This one, the Tandy PCs. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of a Tandy PC. Really, I'm surprised that many of you know it. Most of you do, a few of you don't. Where would you buy a Tandy PC? Where's the only place you could buy one? Anybody remember? Say it again. Radio Shack. That's where you went to buy it. I remember talking to the vice president of Tandy when they were on their high moments, and they were talking about whether they were going to keep in the PC market or not. Subsequently, numbers of years later, they went out of the PC market. But Tandy was almost like the equivalent that you would think of today of IBM or Dell. That's where you went to get your computer. You went to the Radio Shack. Do you know how much the Tandys cost about that time? Anybody want to take a guess? About $399. Anybody want to guess what the Apples cost about that time? $400, a little bit more, about $1,200. Sometimes if you got more of the higher end ones, they could run about $2,400, but pretty affordable for the most part. All right, well, shall we get back to ACC? What decade am I in still? 1970s. You notice where I'm standing about in the room now? Where was that where I started? 1898. And we went to 1970, 17, in the 20s, then the 40s, and then the 60s, and now I'm about to the 1970s. So let's see what's happening in Austin in regards to the community colleges about that time, shall we? I put 2 pictures up here. The first gentleman is named Thomas Hatfield. The second gentleman is named Will Davis. Mr. Hatfield, or Dr. Hatfield, had become an employee at the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Sound familiar? And he was an associate commissioner there. And he was concerned that Houston, Port Arthur, Beaumont, and El Paso and Austin did not have community colleges. And especially when he's working for the coordinating board, which is located here in Austin. So everybody in this great state of Texas is getting community colleges, but nothing in Austin. And he became concerned about that. So he talked to his good friend, Will Davis. Will Davis, at the time, was on the Austin Independent School District Board of Trustees. And they got to talking, and they both acknowledged that there was something amiss here. We needed a community college. However, do you remember back in 1963 and again in 1968, they had tried to create one. And both times, what had failed? The tax base. So they thought, not a good track record, and we're now in the 1970s, and we're, our chances of getting one passed is not good. So Dr. Hatfield looked through the legislation, and he found a loophole in the legislation that allowed community colleges to be created. And this is what he found. He found that the coordinating board could call an election to be held. And it would not require a tax base. Now this is really important to understand about ACC's history because we are different than any other community college in the state of Texas in this regard. So here we are. Dr. Hatfield has determined that the coordinating board can call an election in this Austin area and that he and his good friend, Will Davis, will talk to the Board of Trustees of Austin ISD. And what they will do is they will ask the board of the Austin ISD to serve as the board for the community college if it gets started. And also, they will ask the Austin Independent School District to provide some operating money in lieu of having a tax base. And they made that proposal together to the Austin Independent School District. And the answer from the school district was, yes, we are agreeable to that kind of a situation. Here, ladies and gentlemen, were the members of the Austin Independent School District at that time, our visionary leaders, to whom we owe so much for the creation of Austin Community College. This lady, you can see some of the names. Does anybody know who this is? Carol Keaton Rylander, and her last name now is Strayhorn. Right, she was a member of the school board. She was also state comptroller subsequent to this. Does anybody know who this is? Gus Garcia. Tell me about Gus. Anybody know about him? He was on the school board. He subsequently became say it, Pat, city council member, and after that he subsequently became, say it, Ava, the mayor of Austin, right. Now who is this precious lady right here? Wilhelmina Dilko. Tell me about Wilhelmina Dilko. She became a state rep. Does anybody in this college, anybody in this room rather, know a lady who works for ACC right now today, and her name is Loretta Edelin? Raise your hand if you know Loretta Edelin. Guess who Loretta Edelin's mother is? You didn't know that? Wilhelmina Delco. Right. Uh-huh. Isn't it interesting how the history unfolds? Well, Loretta works right now. She's housed at what is now our Eastview campus. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Very wonderful lady who also became a state representative. Dr. Pat Cato was a local physician in town, and Will Davis, subsequently to serving on the Austin Independent School District Board, moved to become a member of the State Board of Education for the state of Texas. Well, anyway, here's what happened. Dr. Hatfield and then Will Davis convinced the board to support the establishment of a community college, and the Austin Independent School District Board of Trustees would serve as the community college's board of trustees, and the Austin Community College, and the Austin Independent School District would provide funding, and they would see if they could go out for an election that would create a community college without what? Without a tax base. So, there was an interesting comment by the superintendent at that time in Austin named Jack Davidson. And the reason I put this in there is because this was printed in the Austin American Statesman at the time. And every now and then, this comment has come back to haunt ACC. It shouldn't, but he has been misquoted. And because it's a part of the history of ACC, I want to point it out to you. So Jack Davidson, during this agreement, was the superintendent of Austin ISD. And he said, when we as an Austin ISD are going to help fund, in lieu of a tax base, fund Austin Community College, it will not cost the local Austin Independent School District taxpayers at that time an increase in your property taxes in order to do this. So he was speaking to the Austin ISD constituency, and in order to allow them to understand that they had enough operating budget to allow this to occur without raising AISD's property taxes at that time. All right, people nowadays have come back and said to us, ACC made a promise it would never have a tax base and it would never raise taxes. That has nothing to do with ACC. That quote was attributable to the superintendent AISD, speaking from the point of view of what they tax. All right, there was an election day that was held then to create this community college. It was held on December the 9th, 1972. I want to hold that till you've got the sound up. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Will Davis now. He was on the Austin School District. He was the friend of Dr. Hatfield who determined that we would have this election that I just told you about. Now Will tell you about it. Will you make sure the sound's up nice and loud, please?
There was an old statute, an old law that permitted public school boards, public school districts to create a community college. And we could be the governing body for that community college. I think there were two at the time, one in Houston and one in El Paso. And so having the statutory ability to do this, we thought we had the credibility and capacity to convince the people to do it.
I'm not sure was it groundswell as much as
Wilhelmina.
a serious concern about a community as large, as diverse, and as educationally attuned as Austin was, not having what it was a very significant movement in higher education. And there was a concern that the closest one was actually in Central Texas. And it just seemed that it would be a little bit out of kilter for the large community of Austin to have to commute to a smaller community.
I literally went door to door knocking. I put on my tennis shoes and warm ups, my usual account. But I went door to door knocking doors, campaigning for the community college. We were very concerned because since the junior college issue has been approved twice.
It was a unique sort of proposal because we were, as I said a moment ago, we were kind of in the middle of planning for desegregation of Hendrix. And that freed up the building of 12th and Rio Grande as a campus, surface property. And freed up the old Anderson High School, which is over in Utah. It gave us two really fine buildings that could be used for campus for the community college. And that's the one of the big things you have is access to capital property and buildings. And these buildings had our own leadership, and we had a plan to do it on a very low cost basis. That was enough to convince the people that it should be done.
Isn't that wonderful? So you saw Wilhelmina, you saw Carol Keaton, Rylander, Strayhorn, you saw Will Davis talking about how they went out for this election. So, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. The election was held December the 9th, 1972. This was the headlines for the Austin American Statesman the next day, December the 10th, 1972. Voters okay, community college. Now there were three pivotal things that happened on the day before. On December the 9th, it was determined that if you had an election in December, there would probably be a light voter turnout. And the thinking was to have the election in December because those who might likely vote for it would likely go to the polls. But three things that were pivotal occurred on that particular day. It rained. It poured. It poured and poured and poured. And it was a cold, cold winter day. Cold and rain. And secondly, this is Texas. We do have football. And there was a Dallas Cowboy football game on that day. And people stayed home and didn't go to the polls to watch the football game. And third, it was in December, in the height of the shopping season, with people getting ready for the holidays. And those three factors probably contributed to the passage of the election that created Austin Community College. There were only about 10,000 voters who showed up that day, but it passed at a whopping 79% in favor. So those who wanted it to pass, they weathered the weather, they skipped the football game, and they shopped later. And they went to the polls and they passed it. And voila, the creation of Austin Community College. To this moment, it still gives me goosebumps. Now, we now have money from the Austin Independent School District, however, but the election was passed without a tax base. All right, are you ready to move with me in time? Here we go. The election was what year? December 1972. Look what happened. Watch me. We're going to talk about months, not years. 1972, December, it passes. In May, guess who becomes named as the president of ACC, the first president of Austin Community College? Who? Dr. Hatfield from the coordinating board, who had found the loophole, who was a friend of Will Davis, who made all of this happen. He was named in May, 5 months later after the election, to become the first president of ACC. In June, July, August, and September, they hired the faculty, they hired the staff, they wrote the policies to create the college, they built the courses, they built the schedule, and Will Davis and Dr. Hatfield drove around Austin, and you heard Will Davis talk about it on the video a moment ago. They had no building to offer the classes in. So through the generosity of Austin ISD, they used the old Anderson High School, which at that time was located about a block west of where our current Eastview campus is. And they named that to be the primary campus for ACC. And then we also used the old Austin High School, which became our Rio Grande campus. And we offered classes at that Austin High School until Austin High School moved to its new location, and then ACC went into a long-term use to use those two facilities. So the old Anderson High School and the old Austin High School were vacated buildings that the district allowed us to use, and those became our two primary campuses. Isn't that something? All right, so registration started on September 10, 11, 12, and 13, and classes started on the 17th of September. Wham, bam. From December to September, here we are, from no community college in existence to a community college, a president, faculty, courses, 2 buildings, and we're off and running in less than a year. Try doing that today. Right, not likely to happen. So the main location was the Ridgeview campus. Here were the Rio Grande campus as we know it now was the old Austin High School, and we offered classes at Crockett and Reagan. This was the budget that the college operated in opening with. About 400,000 of that, 424,000 of that came from Austin ISD, and the remaining came from the state monies that we got. So we still have the state reimbursement, this one, and we still have the tuition and fees that we're not charging, but we open and we still don't have a tax base. All right, so now we're going to speed up considerably. We opened with this many students, and we hired 25 full-time faculty. Guess where those faculty came from? And it wasn't Austin ISD because they have to have a master's degree. They came from Central Texas College in Killeen because they had sent some classes in. All right, now this one's probably going to blow your mind. So here we go. Guess who one of those faculty members was? Nope. Good guess. Nope. Nope, so I'm going to go ahead and tell you. Who in this room has heard of our present board of the chair of the Austin Community College Board of Trustees? Who is our chair? Dr. who? Dr. Barbara Mink. Guess who was one of the first 25 faculty who came from Central Texas College to teach at the Ridgeview campus? Dr. Mink. Wow. Isn't that something? Anybody in this room know that? Thank her. Thank her for being one of the first faculty members. You have to have a master's degree, and in teaching academic transfer courses, 18 hours specific in the content area for which you were going to teach. And so we had many of the faculty from Central Texas College who were teaching academic transfer and some that were teaching the workforce courses. And some of both of those were in that group of 25 who came over to teach.
None of them ever
Some of them did because they might have taught workforce courses, which is not required. They have different criteria for teaching. But I thought it was very interesting that Dr. Mink, who is now our chair and has served on our board for many years, was one of the original faculty members of ACC. We opened a college with 30 programs to study. All right, I'm about to hear now. What decade am I in? 1980s. Let's just, most of you all, is there anybody in this room, let's put it into the negative. Is there anyone in this room who was not living in the 1980s? Go ahead and tweak up your little hands and let us know how young you are. No one? I actually had someone, I think last year or the year before, who had not yet been born by 1980. It was interesting. So, you know, when we were talking about Woodstock and all these things, they were just like, huh? It was really fun. All right, so I'm up to the 1980s. Let's look at a few of these icons. Do you see anything that's outstanding to you? Well, how about this one? The internet, cell phones. How about this one? MTV. We first started talking about global warming. The Berlin Wall. Berlin used to be split between East and West, and that wall came down. Major pivotal moments in the 1980s. Let's see what was happening here at ACC in the 1980s. So we now have a community college. We're located at what was the old Anderson High School that we renamed to become the Ridgeview campus, and we're operating out of the old Austin High School, which we now renamed as the Rio Grande campus. Well, we decided in the 1980s, in 1981, that it was time to go back out and have another election and ask to see if the voters would pass a tax base. And guess what happened? We did go out for another election. And what did the electorate say for a third time? No. So here we are with another no. And because of that, it caused the college to be limited in its growth ability, because we only have these two remaining amounts of ways to bring in money: tuition and fees and the allocation from the state. So we had very limited growth. During the early 1980s then, there were conversations with the Austin Independent School District, and the Board of Trustees at that time said, you know, you all have made it. You've established yourself, you're standing on your own 2 feet, you're in 2 buildings, you're at Crockett and you're at Reagan also. It's time for you all to create your own board and kind of stand on your own and not have to have the support of ACC, excuse me, of AISD. Finally, in 1986, the college went back 5 years later after this for the 4th time to the Austin community and said, would you vote to establish a tax base to help create, I'll need for you to do that please, to help create the Austin Community College District. And in 1981, in March 1981, the electorate finally said, yes. Hallelujah! Finally. And they decided that they would give us 5 cents per $100 valuation on property taxes. And that finally established the tax base for ACC. Well, ladies and gentlemen, with that, the college had money in its pocket. And it could finally grow and expand. And it did. And we also entered into the economic boom times of the 1980s that were occurring. And everything was just hot to trot, so they say. And the only caveat to this 5 cents was that a part of the condition of the passing of that 5 cents, in the passage of that appropriation, it said this: we will give you 5 cents per valuation. We will allow that to occur. But, Austin Community College Board of Trustees, you may never raise the tax rate unless you come back to us in an election and we pass it as the voters. And we who are in your taxing district will vote. We will, as voters in your constituency, as to whether or not you can raise your tax rate or not. You, as a Board of Trustees, cannot do it on your own. It must go back for a general election in order for that 5 cent cap to be changed ever. Again, another interesting and unique piece about ACC. as compared to other community colleges. So that's what happened. We hit the boom years. Everything was grand. We started expanding courses like crazy. Everything was going beautifully. And the president at the college at that time was named Dan Angel. And Dr. Angel promised the people that when they went to the polls and created this 5-cent tax base, that he was going to create a campus in every quadrant of this area, this regional area. Thus, we began to get locations at Riverside and Cypress Creek, and a couple of others that I'll mention in just a moment. So things began to boom. It boomed, and it boomed, and it boomed, and it boomed. High tech was king. We were beginning to offer computer science classes. The tech industry was moving from California to here. We were becoming known as Silicon Valley Junior. Did anybody ever hear of that term in Austin? We were flush with money. Times were grand. It was terrific. And then we hit the 2000s. And into the early 2000s, these were the things that were occurring. Very exciting things. The startup companies on the internet, the dot-coms, the biotechnologies, the going green and the sustainability initiatives, economic globalization across the world rather than the nation, your iPods, distance learning, all of these things began to occur in the 2000s. Where am I standing in our timeline? Into the 2000s. Here I am. Life is great. Hallelujah. Thank you, Lord. Right? And then we busted. And we busted along with everybody else in the United States. Dot-coms lost their businesses. They were falling off left and right. People who were millionaires were no longer had any money. The tech industry faltered greatly. We lost jobs by the hundreds and by the thousands. The courses at ACC where we were teaching tech and computer sciences, I was canceling and canceling and canceling sections in the fall, spring, and summer semesters. We were just wiping out our course offerings in these areas. We also started to get reduced state money and this little piece of the pie for our funding because the state was feeling the economic downturn and could no longer give community colleges the amount of money that it once was going. At the same time, I think it's fair to acknowledge that we had gone through some very fast growth, and with that comes growing pains. And we had some turmoil at our board level and at the administration level and within the whole entire culture of the college. And things were not always peaceful and happy. And we went through some rough periods of years during that early 2000 time period. In 2003, Austin Community College took a brave new step. It decided that it would go back to the voters and it would ask the voters to change this 5 cents to 9 cents and also to pass a $99 million bond initiative, which would allow us to buy some more buildings, to buy upgraded equipment, to hire more staff, to offer more programs. Some of you in this room, your positions may be a direct result of the benefit of the college passing that election. It did pass. And today, the college is still at that tax rate of 9 cents per $100 evaluation. So that was a joyous time. We also changed the leadership. There was some turnover both within the administration, within faculty and staff, and at the board level. And people kind of got their hearts back together again and focused on the right things instead of some of the other things that they had been focused on. And so also we began to see the local economy recover in Austin. And to this day, frankly, to this day, we are much better off in Austin and in Texas than we are in some of our sister states. So we are very fortunate, and the college has been reinvigorated. And so you see now some of the things that we've added into our programs since the early 2000s. All of these are new that have come on in the last 10 years, 8 years or so. We've expanded our tax district by having additional annexations out into the larger communities. And so we are very, very fortunate with growing enrollments and growing programs. This is currently our organizational chart. You heard from Dr. Rhodes this morning. And we have, this is the most of the administration and most of the organization of the college. This one is me. And this one is the provost that there's a vacancy for. And this one is for the Ben Farrell, who's over finance and business, and then some other staff here too. And so this is the structure of the college. You will see that we're still very lean in terms of numbers of people. We are not a bloated institution in terms of administration at all, especially considering the size of our organization. So let me have you have a moment of 10 seconds of silence to view where we have come and notice where I am standing now. Doesn't it make your heart swell with pride? And also, and this is our service area now for Austin Community College. Look where we are now. We serve 8 counties, and the green area is now our taxing district as of last November. So we are now drawing out of the green area money that helps support the operational cost of the college. And also, if you see these little dots here, these are our campuses, and if you see these other little uncolored dots, these are where we have ACC centers dispersed throughout the 8-county service area. We have 11 centers right now. Look over there at that side of the room in 1898. Look at where we are today. All right, this is our vision, which is the ACC will be recognized as the preferred gateway to higher ed and training, and as the catalyst for social equity, economic development, and personal enrichment. And that is the mantra under which ACC operates to this day. In the last numbers of years, we've had enormous benefits in tax increases, growth in our student success programs, planning for land acquisitions, and so forth. We have a soaring enrollment right now this semester of over 45,000 students. We have many programs that are focused just on trying to encourage individuals to come to ACC or to go to college. What's beyond that wall? What's ahead in the coming decades? I can tell you a little bit about what's coming to happen from here to the fruit tray. I probably won't be here beyond that. Many of us in this room won't be. Dr. Grubbs and I will be gone. You all, many of you, will be standing here one day telling a group of ACC Academy members about the history of ACC. But you will be telling them about 2020, 2030, 2040, 2050. I wish I could live long enough to hear you give that presentation. I can tell you a little bit about what's going to happen from here to the fruit tray. Elgin campus, this is our land. We've purchased it. It's almost 100 acres. It's on Highway 290 going east out of Austin. You drive straight through Manor and you keep going about another 14 miles. And here is our property on the corner of 290 and County Line Road, right on 290. All right, Hayes campus. Hayes campus we've been delayed on a little bit because of some litigation that had occurred that we hope will end very soon. We've progressed on that land. So here, if you are familiar at all with, this is I-35, this would be Austin up here, going southbound towards San Marcos and San Antonio. This is in the Kyle Buda area. This is Kohler's Crossing, which is a major intersection that intersects with I-35. And then this one is Kyle Parkway. There's a HEB right about here. There's another HEB up in this one, but there's a larger one here, and that's when I tell people to get there. The best way from Austin to get to this location is come down I-35. Don't take this exit. Take the Kyle Parkway exit. There's a big four-light intersection, gigantic overpass intersection. Take that one, take a right, and curve around. This is a big four-way stop right here, and this red part is ACC's property. Right here is, if you're familiar with Hayes Consolidated Independent School District, there's a performing arts center right there on that corner. And there's a golf course called, and a country club called Plum Creek. and that is right there. This will be a very, very large intersection as well. This campus and the Elgin campus were both intended to open, not in 5 months, as we did back in the 1970s, but in 2 years. So the planned opening for both of these campuses was August 2013, 2 years from today. So you see I am moving closer to the fruit tray. And the Hayes campus will be slightly delayed. At this point, the projected time for that one is 2014. All right. Quickly then, this is a drawing, a rendering of the Hayes campus. It may change, but this is generally what the conceptual idea will be for that campus. And now we also have the Highland Mall, that you can look out the window and see. And the Highland Mall, I have 2 schematics here so that you can view this. They are actually the same. This is the Highland Mall itself. And this is the Highland Mall with some red lines drawn over it so that you can actually see. So for those of you who shop, this is the old Penny's. This is the old Macy's. This is the old Ladies Dillard's. Over here was the old Men's Dillard's, and then the interior of the mall walkway. Does that help you orient? HBC that we're sitting in right now is right here. ACC now owns all of this property, and the ground lease is under this middle section. We own the Penny's, the Macy's, the Dillard's, and the ground underneath those buildings that are in the middle there for right now. We are just now beginning our discussions and plans for Highland Mall. Over the coming years, especially in the coming year, and I'm way over here now by the fruit tray, we are going to be talking about the development. In fact, we have been in the last few weeks talking about what's going to go over there and where. And so this is going to be an exciting new growth opportunity for ACC. And then, not to rest on our laurels, we have already bought 100 acres up in the Leander area. And our next campus will be in Leander. We have not set the timeline for it, but ladies and gentlemen, this is Highway 183A, and this is Highway 183. That gives you an orientation. And this is in Leander, far north. And again, we've already bought the property for this one, but we have not yet set the timeline for that particular campus. All right, I want you to hear what our pioneers did for us through our walk through history for today.
I'm a real believer that the city of Austin, as the capital city, belongs to no special interest group, no special political credo, no special individual. It belongs to all Austinites, and in a sense, it belongs to all Texans in the capital city. Nothing more exemplifies that as Austin Community College.
The product and myself of a community college system, I can tell you that I never would have gone to college. We've had a community college in my city.
One of the things that we said was that the community college was successful if it penetrated every home in its designated community. So we tried to offer the diversity that would make it attractive in terms of options to people all over Austin.
I never thought that it was anything. Nor do I wish that it was needed more human needs than we were at Austin Community College.
No frills, doesn't have any football team, either win or lose, national championship, doesn't have any basketball team, no band, no cheerleaders, no, it does a fine job for people.
This is Thomas Hatfield, first president of Austin Community College, a pivotal community member that made the election, the original election to create this institution, alive. This is a quote from him when he said, "It is not as important what happens within the edifice as what happens in the lives of people who pass through it." Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mary Hensley. I'm Executive Vice President at Austin Community College for College Operations. It is a joy and a pleasure, an honor and a privilege to tell you that I am ACC and that you, as our Academy members, I want you to stand. I want you to join hands with one another. What I want you to say with me is, we are ACC. We are ACC. and we entrust the future of this college to you. I thank you so much for the opportunity to visit with you this morning. It's been